Welcome back to Inception Dialogues. I've just had a nice conversation with American journalist John Horgan, who is a science writer. He writes for the Scientific American. He has also written a number of books about science and philosophy, some of them very well known, like The End of Science from the mid-90s. What motivated us to come together this time was the fact that John has an interest in Thomas Kuhn, a famous philosopher of science, my very favorite philosopher of science. And John not only has an interest in Kuhn, he has also met Thomas Kuhn personally and has had a long conversation with him in the 90s, a couple of years prior to Kuhn's death. And we've discussed Kuhn's philosophy, how John interprets his philosophy, John's own ideas about it. But because we jump right into the meat of Thomas Kuhn's philosophy, this episode requires a little more of an introduction. Kuhn has written a seminal book in the 20th century called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I have a copy here, that's the third edition. And in it, the central thesis of Kuhn's idea is to dismiss the positivist notion of scientific development as a steady, monotonic progress towards the ultimate truth, as a one-directional development towards truth that gets validated through comparison of scientific theories with neutral empirical data and experiment. What Kuhn said was that historically, this is not the way science has developed. This is not the way science has advanced. What actually happens is that scientists need a paradigm, a set of beliefs, assumptions about the nature of reality, which enables them to interpret the very data that comes out of empirical experiments. Kuhn put forward the notion that without a preconceived set of values, beliefs, and assumptions about reality, one cannot interpret the data. As such, the data are not neutral. The data are already laden with the beliefs, assumptions of the paradigm. And the way science develops is, although there is a certain reinforcement mechanism behind a paradigm which tends to perpetuate it, once there are enough anomalies accumulating, a paradigm is exchanged for another paradigm, for another set of assumptions, beliefs, and preconceptions about the nature of reality, which explains the prior data and the new anomalies. Kuhn has been interpreted as a relativist philosopher, because his key notion was that truth and falsity only exist within the context of a paradigm, not as absolutes. And the way science has developed is not this monotonic, steady progress in a single direction, the direction of the ultimate truth, but as a more or less arbitrary dance of paradigms in which one paradigm is replaced by another, which is replaced by another, and sometimes they go back and forth in the set of assumptions, values, and beliefs that they make about the nature of reality. As such, scientific conclusions, according to Kuhn, are fundamentally relative. They are not a glimpse at the ultimate raw truth, but they are a mixture of what the empirical data tell you and the subjective aspects that you bring to bear when you interpret that empirical data. So John and I talked for a little over an hour about Kuhn's ideas, John's own take on his ideas, and then we expanded the conversation into other related subject areas that are of interest to John, including towards the very end, the interface between science and spirituality, mind and the brain, and so on. I think you'll find this conversation quite interesting. So join me and John for the 5th episode of Inception Dialogues. Before we get really to the meat, John, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a journalist, you've written books, you write for the Scientific American, right?
Yeah, so I've been a science writer for exactly 30 years now. I was an English major as an undergraduate, but I've always loved science. I was split when I was a young person between whether I should be a writer or a scientist, and then I realized I could be a science writer, and it turned out to be the perfect career for me. So I specialized in that when I went to a graduate school in journalism. I first got a job for an engineering magazine writing about national security issues, then got a wonderful job at Scientific American where I could write about anything.
All the cool
And
stuff.
yeah, it was great. I wrote about particle physics, about evolutionary biology, about brain science, about mathematics and complexity theory. And I also did, with the encouragement of my editor, I did a series of profiles of famous scientific figures. And what was great is that I didn't have to find any news angle. I could just think of somebody I would really like to meet and talk to and seek them out and try to convince them to talk to me and then write about it.
That's
And
fantastic.
and so I did a series of philosophers, including Karl Popper, Paul Feyerabend, who's one of the most remarkable people I've ever met, the great philosopher, and Thomas Kuhn, of course.
And those
So
dialogues became a book, right? You wrote a book with those dialogues.
yeah, so I wrote, my first book was called The End of Science. And I had this radical thesis that science is approaching its limits, at least science in the grand mode, science as this great quest to try to understand the universe and our place in it. And I had chapters. I've got it. Here's a copy
Show us, yes.
right here. I was just flipping through it. So I've got chapters called, so it's The End of Science, and chapters are called The End of Particle Physics, The End of Cosmology, The End of Evolutionary Biology, and I've got a chapter called The End of Philosophy.
Wow.
And that consists basically of my three profiles of Popper, Kuhn, and Feyerabend, and an examination of their very critical philosophies and views of science.
We will come back to your book later on.
Okay.
What brought us together, I think, was that you've met Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, personally. You've had the rare opportunity to speak to the man himself,
Right.
who was famous for writing that revolutionary book. I have it with me, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I have the third edition. And you've written almost exactly a year ago, almost to the day, you've written an article for the Scientific American, which I also have here with me, in which you tell about your meeting with Kuhn, which had taken place years before, I think in the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've made in this article the best summary ever, the best one-liner summary ever of Thomas Kuhn's idea. You wrote that according to Kuhn, scientists can never truly understand the real world, between quotes, or even each other. That's it. That's exactly it, boiled down to one line. Can you elaborate on this? How did you come to this?
Thank you. Yeah, so Thomas Kuhn was such a complicated and interesting person, and I'm so arrogant that I think in some ways he didn't fully understand how radical his view of the world is. And so to me, he's really kind of a philosopher of language and of the limits of language for knowing reality. Language as used in any way. I mean, his focus was on science and how as science evolves, the meaning of certain scientific terms evolves, like mass and motion and energy and time and things like that. And there's some obvious examples of that when you go from classical physics to 20th century physics, and some of the changes in terminology that you got as a result of quantum mechanics and relativity. But I realized on reading Structure of Scientific Revolution and thinking about it before I met Kuhn, and then thinking over what he told me, that he's really talking about how language, as we use it even in non-scientific interactions, is it's our way of coming to terms with the world, of course, and it helps us communicate with each other and arrive at common meanings. But language is also always a kind of barrier as well to really understanding how things are. And it's this kind of filter, and it's always filtering out something essential. That's what I think that Kuhn was really saying, and it's this profoundly pessimistic picture of the human effort to really come to terms with this crazy reality that we're living in. And the weird thing about Kuhn is that I felt as though he, part of him realized that that's what he was doing, but another part of him was appalled by this great revelation that he had and was backpedaling away from it and trying to figure out ways around it so that some kind of concept of truth, whether scientific or other kinds of truth, could be preserved. And as a result of this kind of contradiction and tension in himself, I got the sense that he was kind of a tortured person who had what was almost like a mystical revelation, and that was very disturbing to him, and that he spent the whole rest of his career trying to come to terms with.
You summarized it by saying that language is the barrier. It's our only tool to communicate, to share truth, but it's also a fundamental barrier to truth. It insulates us from the truth. If you put it that way, it sounds like a more or less ordinary epistemic thing, not a mystical revelation.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I forget if I even mentioned it in that Scientific American piece, but I grew up in the 60s, and so I took psychedelics, LSD, other drugs, where you have these experiences. You see reality in a way that you realize language is totally inadequate to describe. All right, it's a kind of mystical experience. This is what William James meant when he said that the mystical revelation is ineffable. It's beyond language. So fine, I accept that. And as you say, in a way, it's a kind of philosophical commonplace. Kant certainly talked about it.
Yeah.
Even Plato talked about the limits of language in the cave and all that sort of stuff. But even if you grant that, I think you'd have to say that language in some ways is extraordinarily effective.
Mm-hmm.
And science itself, which uses language at its best in these very precise ways, it has been extraordinarily successful at helping us come to terms with certain aspects of reality. And I don't think Kuhn granted that enough. He had his view of language and reality was too global, and he didn't account for the fact that certain kinds of language that were describing certain kinds of science actually are incredibly effective at describing and pinning down certain parts of reality.
You've alluded to the mystical revelation that Kuhn had, and you're probably referring to the 1947 epiphany that he had about Aristotelian physics. Before I ask you the question, just for the benefit of the audience, I wanted to read a little part of how Wikipedia describes Aristotelian physics.
Okay.
And it's the part about natural motion. I'll just quote a little brief passage. So according to Aristotle, quote, terrestrial objects tend toward a different part of the universe according to their composition of the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire. For example, Earth, the heaviest element, tends towards the center of the universe. Hence, the reason for the Earth being at the center. At the opposite extreme, the lightest element, fire, tends upward, away from the center. The relative proportion of the four elements composing an object determines its motion. Eminently logical and eminently absurd. And yet, in your article, when you described Kuhn's epiphany about Aristotelian physics, you said that to Kuhn, suddenly Aristotle made sense when he was staring out of his window. He could understand Aristotle, that there was a way in which Aristotelian physics was correct, and it was not better or worse than physics today. How on earth can that be? What do you think Kuhn saw? What do you think he experienced in that moment of epiphany?
I think he suddenly understood Aristotle's terms. So he had been trying to understand Aristotle, to use a Kuhnian term, from the modern paradigm of physics and of science more generally. And from that modern perspective, looking back, Aristotle looks crazy, just weird. He doesn't make any sense, or profoundly flawed in some ways. And the shift in his thinking came when he started understanding Aristotle in his own terms. So he had this kind of gestalt shift where suddenly he was inhabiting Aristotle's world and seeing the world as Aristotle did. And that was the crux of Kuhn's philosophy, that we are always, that there is no purely neutral, objective standpoint from which to see the universe. You always have some mindset that is often defined by a particular kind of language from which you're viewing the universe. And so from that, he concluded that if you're looking at the history of science, you can't say, as you put it, that that we're going from bad theories to better theories, and even possibly to true theories of nature. You're just changing. You're going from one paradigm to another, but there is no absolute objective viewpoint from which you can say the newer paradigm is true and the old paradigm is false. A really very profound, radical view of science and its relationship to nature, and one that I think is accurate in describing certain kinds of science, but completely false in describing other parts of science.
Kuhn wrote in a part of his book that he thought that, and I'll quote, something like a paradigm is prerequisite to perception itself. He was speculating. He was not making this as a statement of truth, but something he suspected. He suspected that you needed a paradigm in order to even perceive the world. In other words, that as he said, the data are not neutral. The data is already laden with the assumptions, beliefs, and values of a paradigm. That if you remove the storyline, the narrative of a paradigm, you will not perceive anything. There will be no perception. That is very radical in my view, because it sort of crosses out the correspondence theory of truth. The idea in philosophy of science that a statement or a thought is true or false if it corresponds to a neutral, objective fact in nature. What Kuhn is saying is that either that doesn't exist, or if it exists, we can't access it because the data are not neutral. It's paradigm laden already.
Yeah, and I get that, and I grant it. I mean, this is what we were talking about before as well, and it's a statement about the limits of language and the relationship between language and absolute reality, whatever the hell that is. But it doesn't acknowledge the degree to which the history of science, in certain respects, shows humans actually coming to grips with reality in really significant ways and discovering new facts about the world. So the shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism, to say that is, it's not that heliocentrism is just different from, rather than superior to geocentrism, to my mind, is just crazy. To say that the old Aristotelian notion of elements as whatever it is, earth, fire, air, and water, that was just different from our modern understanding of elements, which started emerging, 150, 200 years ago, that the old notion is just different from the modern version. Again, I see that as absolutely absurd. Kuhn was asking us to believe that all scientific knowledge is to some extent invented. It's this postmodern idea of knowledge all being constructed and being a projection of the particular culture from which it emerges. And again, in a trivial sense, that's true, but it doesn't acknowledge that, to my mind, elements are actually really out there. There are certain facts that science has uncovered that become a permanent part of our foundation of knowledge, and it's inconceivable that there will be some further paradigm shift that will make us see, for example, the theory of elements and the modern theory of elements in the same way that we now see the theory of elements of ancient Greeks. Science actually does discover the truth and progresses in a very dramatic way that Kuhn was asking us, in violation of common sense, not to believe.
I want to explore this further with you. I think this is the key point here, and I want to quote you in your article, because your article is very sympathetic to Kuhn and Kuhn's ideas throughout, until almost the very end, in which you basically say what you just said. In other words, you said Kuhn's insight forced him to take the untenable position that because all scientific theories fall short of absolute, mystical truth, they are all equally untrue. And then you say, fields that achieve consensus or normalcy, to borrow Kuhn's term, do so because their paradigms, or at least certain components of them, correspond to something real in nature. So you're basically contradicting Kuhn's idea, which is that the notion of truth and falsity only exist within the context of a paradigm. He didn't deny that there are true things and false things. He only said that true and false can only exist when it's couched in the context of a paradigm and not as absolutes. Right. You disagree with that, but then you disagree with the essence of Kuhn. I mean, can we look at Kuhn in shades of gray? Or are his ideas binary in this sense, that if truth and falsity only exist within a paradigm, you can't get away from this. You can't say what you said.
Well, so I'm citing examples from the history of physics to support my idea that science progresses. All right, and that science discovers facts about nature. Facts like elements, facts like subatomic particles, like neutrons and electrons and protons and so forth. I think Kuhn is right that there are some aspects of our description of, for example, an electron that 100 years from now we might look back on and see were culturally defined and were distorted by our current paradigm. But I think there will also be aspects of our current understanding of subatomic physics, including electrons, that we will see as true and as part of this process of discovery of the physical substance of nature. So here's the problem I have with Kuhn, and I forget if I said this in my Scientific American article. Kuhn doesn't recognize, because he's too as I said, his generalizations are too broad. He doesn't recognize this remarkable fact, when you look at all different branches of science, that there's some areas of science that make this incredible progress that can be measured in a lot of ways. And physics is the most dramatic example of that. And then there are other areas of science that seem to be constantly spinning their wheels and lurching from one paradigm to another, in the same way that kids change their taste in popular music. It's very faddish, right? So the obvious example of that kind of faddish science that really doesn't seem to be progressing is the sciences of the human mind and the sciences of human nature, psychology especially, which, in spite of the attempts to biologize it through neuroscience and so forth, is still seeking its great unifying paradigm, and also has very little to show in the way of applications of its knowledge that lead you to be more secure that your theory is really an accurate depiction of reality. The way I just described it to one of my classes was that physics in the 20th century, one reason we can really believe physics is because it gave us the thermonuclear bomb. I mean, what a confirmation that your understanding of matter is accurate, that you can build this incredibly destructive, dramatic device. Where is the equivalent of a thermonuclear bomb emerging from mind science, from psychology? This is all left out from Kuhn's picture of science.
I will try to antagonize you to enrich the discussion, to extract more of you. One could argue that physics looks at very simple experiments in which the number of variables is small compared to psychology or sociology or political sciences, in which the number of variables explodes exponentially and one cannot get a grip. So the number of potential anomalies in these more abstract sciences is hugely greater than the potential number of anomalies that contradict the paradigm in physics. And the opportunity for confirmation bias in physics, the idea that a paradigm self-reinforces by choosing the data that will lead to results that confirm itself, that idea of confirmation bias that we talked about earlier has a much greater opportunity to manifest itself in physics with a low number of variables than in psychology with a high number of variables where you don't close that self-reinforcing loop. Couldn't that be an alternative explanation?
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it, but it seems to me that it's unfair to call it a bias if your particular way of looking at an experiment and the results you expect from the experiment are so dramatically confirmed, as experiments have been in physics over the course of the 20th century. You don't get anything remotely resembling that from psychology. And I think that the reason is obvious, as you said, that when you're talking about the human brain and the human mind, even deciding what should count as a fact, even deciding what are, I don't know, the kind of elemental constituents of a mind, it becomes totally arbitrary. And the wonderful thing is that William James wrote about this more than 100 years ago. You go back and read William James in Principles of Psychology, published in the 1890s, and he is worrying about whether psychology can become a science, and trying to compare psychology to physics, and realizing that in many ways they're totally incomparable, because to him it seems that psychology doesn't have any fundamental constituents, and so the mind might be irreducible. And here we are more than 100 years later, and William James so far was right. So then the question is whether the mind sciences and the science of human nature can ever transcend this kind of, I would call it, and again, I think this is where Kuhn is really useful, this pre-scientific state. So the way I understand Kuhn is that science needs a paradigm. It needs a unifying set of ideas and assumptions to really make progress. You don't have that in psychology and the social sciences in general. And I just wrote about this recently on my Scientific American blog. The big question is whether we ever will have that kind of unifying insight. We've had all these different attempts. You've had complexity theorists, you've had cybernetics, you've had sociobiology and its mutant offspring, evolutionary psychology, all claiming that they are going to be the unifying principle for the mind sciences. It just hasn't happened yet. And I suspect that it may never happen, because the mind, human nature, is so mutable, it's so fast changing that science will never catch up to it.
There is this fairly mainstream, maybe not the mainstream, but a fairly common notion in philosophy of science today called AntiRealism, which postulates that anything that you cannot see directly with your five senses, that you can only see indirectly through experiments that confirm the implications of that theory. For instance, the very notion of atoms. We cannot really hold an atom in our hands in itself and look at electrons, protons, and neutrons. This is all derived through implication. Anti-realism would hold that these theories are, quote, convenient fictions. In other words, that things work as though there were protons, neutrons, electrons, and other subatomic particles that interacted in this or that way. And that's why they are very handy for producing technology, for producing the atomic bomb, because things work as though they were true. But we have to stop short from calling them true, because all we know is that insofar as we can see, things work as though they were true. And if you look at physics today with the so-called string theory or brain theory revolution, the underlying story is changing. It's not particles anymore. It's something that vibrates, something abstract, undefinable, that is orders of magnitude smaller than anything we can see, even indirectly. Wouldn't that come back to Kuhn in the sense that these convenient fictures are language structures?
I call string theory science fiction with equations. You're absolutely right. And this is what I've been saying all along, is that Kuhn is really useful for understanding certain kinds of science. I was just talking about mind science. Certainly, when you're talking about string theory, multiverse theories are so popular now. The idea that this universe that we inhabit and that we've mapped out with our telescopes and so forth is maybe just one of an infinite number of these universes in this grand landscape. That's one of the supposed consequences of string theory. Kuhn is useful for understanding that. Another philosopher who comes in handy here is old Karl Popper with his notion of falsification. I tell the string theorists, show me some experiment that can say whether your theory is
falsifiable.
Is falsifiable. Let alone confirmable in the way that neutrons and protons and even quarks have been confirmed. And the problem with string theory and multiverse theories and all that razzmatazz is that there are no experiments that can disprove them. So I don't even think they count as science. I think physics has become pathological. I think physicists are beating up against this wall. They've reached the limits of what physics can really do in this great quest for a unified theory. And so they're kind of going crazy and coming up with all these theories that really don't have any kind of empirical foundation anymore. And then you can talk about these psychological factors that Kuhn was so interested in that help to sustain a given field, even in the absence of any real empirical data.
What I sense from you, John, and I may be completely wrong, but I'll just share with you what I sense listening to you, is an effort to bring together two ideas that, at least at first sight, are contradictory, which is to accept elements of Kuhn, to accept that the data are laden with the paradigm, to accept this more or less relativistic, at least at an epistemic level way of looking at the world. But at the same time, you insist and reject string theory, reject M theory and so on, as fantasies, as stories. But at the same time, you insist, I sense, on absolute truth, on the existence of truth outside of a paradigm, something that really is true in itself. It is really out there. Right. How do you merge these things in your mind?
Well, first of all, I should say that I often, I think I'm in the minority in holding this view. I have a colleague at the school where I teach, Stevens Institute of Technology and Engineering School in New Jersey, who's an historian of science. Great guy, Jim McClellan. He's really, he's brilliant. He studied under Thomas Kuhn at Princeton in the 1970s. We have had these almost screaming matches, the kind of arguments where everybody else is just around us is just rolling their eyes and, kind of drifting away. So let me just tell you one of the arguments that we had. Jim said you used useful fictions, I think, as a term for describing scientific knowledge.
Yeah.
And Jim uses the term stories. And, that we have these stories. Some stories are better than others, but you can't say that one story is true and another is false because there aren't these absolute standards. And so I was trying to come up with counterexamples, and I brought up heliocentrism versus geocentrism, and he said, John, those are actually both perfectly valid. Geocentrism is valid. It's just a different frame for understanding planetary orbits. And so I knew he was going to say that. I fell into his trap. I was really irritated. So I said, okay, what about the story that the Earth is round and not flat or cubical or whatever? And Jim said to me, the Earth isn't round. It's an oblate spheroid. And I said, okay, it's an oblate spheroid. But is there going to be some period in the future when we don't accept that the Earth is an oblate spheroid anymore? That we're going to learn something that makes us realize that our current understanding of the shape of the Earth was totally wrong in the way that, as we said, looking back at Aristotle, that we think of, at least most of us think of Aristotle as being totally wrong. It's just absurd to carry this sort of relativism and social constructive picture of science that far. We now know that the Earth is an oblate spheroid. We now know that matter consists not of earth, air, fire, water, and everything, but of oxygen and sulfur and helium and all these elements in the periodic table. So I guess one of the takeaway messages that I have from Kuhn is that we should be kind of modest in our assertions about what we know about nature, and that nature in some respects, and I've said this in all my writing, I certainly said it in the End of Science, remains profoundly mysterious in spite of all the knowledge that we have about it. But you have to have a philosophy of science, a view of science that acknowledges all these features of reality that we have absolutely discovered that are not just human inventions or not fictions or not stories.
Kuhn wrote, very interesting. I think one of Kuhn's points was that the scientific theories of the past that today we laugh at, they were perfectly good as stories, as convenient fictions, to explain the empirical space of man at that time. Mm-hmm. He even wrote, I'll quote him, if these out-of-date beliefs are to be called myths, then myths can be produced by the same sorts of methods and held for the same sorts of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge. In other words, what is your sphere of empirical experience, and what story can you use to explain your experience within that sphere? And I could argue that when man thought that the Earth was flat, it was a time before automobiles, before planes, before ocean-going ships. And Earth being flat was a fairly good approximation of a small segment of a very large sphere. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't hold in our empirical space of today, because today we fly, today we go to the ocean, today we go to space. So we have a new convenient theory. But there was a time, less than 100 years ago, where we thought that this spheroid was in absolute space-time. Mm-hmm. Today we know it isn't, so there is already another convenient fiction.
You sound just like my friend. That's exactly the same kind of thing that he says, that there are constantly these refinements in our understanding of something like, let's say, I don't know, the shape of a planet, or even, the structure of the solar system, and how that has been redefined by the post-Einstein picture of space and time. And yeah, as I said, I grant all that. And let me put it this way. So Jim calls me a naive realist, and I'm definitely a realist. I don't think I'm naive. I think what not to repeat myself too much, but where I am in total agreement with Kuhn is, and sort of looking forward to how far science can go. So there are some scientists, I've actually met them, they're not as common as you might think, who believe that scientific knowledge will eventually converge totally with, whatever the axis of ultimate truth is, that science will give us a complete picture of reality, so complete that there's no sense of mystery and wonder anymore, that there are no riddles left to solve. To me, that's totally absurd. That either because of the limits of language and the limits of our own mind, and also the physical constraints that science operates under, that reality is always going to be at one remove from our knowledge of it, no matter how far our knowledge proceeds. I mean, the most dramatic example of this, there are some scientists, physicists right now who are claiming that the riddle of the universe has been solved, that we know why there's nothing, why there is something rather than nothing. Lawrence Krauss, the physicist, wrote a really silly book that made this argument recently. It had a foreword by Richard Dawkins, who was all excited because, the ultimate mystery, where did the universe come from in the first place, where religion is still got supposedly something to say. According to Dawkins, it's been dispelled once and for all. Now we know that it was some kind of quantum fluctuation that led the universe to spring into existence. Total bullshit.
Yeah, I agree.
Bullshit. And that's science overreaching. And Kuhn would find that idea that science can totally solve the riddle of the universe absurd, and so do I. But as I said, that shouldn't negate the fact that I believe that the Big Bang modern Big Bang theory has captured something really important about the origin and history of the universe, in the same way that Darwin gave us an insight into the origin and the history of life on Earth. I think that those are, in some ways, that they're stories, but they happen to be true stories. And so to call them myths is just unfair, and it's an abuse of the terminology.
Would it be fair, John, to say that the way you see things is that although the truth is ineffable, fundamentally beyond language, that it does provide a direction and a criterion for us to say we are going the right direction and we are approaching it, or we are going the wrong direction and we are getting further away from it? Is that how you think? You can never reach the goal, but it does give you a sense of direction.
Yeah, I believe in scientific progress, and I think that the history of technology, the applications that have stemmed from our scientific knowledge, and especially in the 20th century, demonstrates progress in our theoretical understanding. I'm a science journalist, and the reason I became a science journalist instead of getting a PhD in literary criticism is because I think that science is our most powerful mode of knowing reality. I still love literature. I'm reading Moby Dick at the moment. And literature can help us understand reality and the human condition in ways that science can't approach. But science is the most exciting part of human culture and has been for quite a while, and I wanted to be part of that. And I wouldn't have become a science writer if I thought that it was all just stories, because that's too much like literary criticism. Literary criticism is just almost all bullshit, right? Very, very clever bullshit, sometimes profound bullshit, but still bullshit at the bottom in ways that science, good science, isn't. I believe that as a science journalist, my job is to try to tell people when certain areas of science have degenerated into bullshit, like string theory, multiverse theories, like theories of human nature that say that war is something that was selected for by natural selection. It's to me totally bullshit, and I can show evidence that tries to undermine that theory. So in other words, I'm saying that there are certain clear standards of evidence that can be applied to tell you what is legitimate, or at least has the hope of becoming some real part of our knowledge, and what is total bullshit and should be discarded. And it's a moral issue too, because politics and international affairs are often concerned with these empirical issues. Whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before the U.S. invaded, that was an empirical question, and I think it's empirical meaning that potentially it could be resolved. We invaded thinking that there were those weapons. We got in there. Turned out that theory was bullshit, and as a consequence, tens of thousands of lives were lost, and all the rest of it. So to me, to say the beef, some of my best friends are postmodernists, but the beef that I have with postmodernists is that they undermine the debate over a lot of these different issues: creationism versus evolutionary theory, global warming, where I believe that one story is actually empirically superior to another story. And if postmodernism becomes a kind of commonplace, then I think it will feed into this cynicism that people have, that science is just all politics. And it's all just these sort of power games that people are playing with each other.
I think Kuhn himself would be very disgusted of this interpretation of his ideas, that science is pure politics.
Yeah, I'm sure he would be. Kuhn was horrified at a lot of the consequences or a lot of the conclusions that people drew from his own philosophy, which is and what made him in some ways a kind of tragic figure. And after Structure of Scientific Revolution, I tried to show this when I wrote about him. He spent much of his life trying to explain what he really meant by the structure of scientific revolution. And the great irony was that, according to his own philosophy, he should have expected to be misunderstood, because language, he said, is always going to be, in some ways, is going to lead to miscommunication and misunderstanding in some ways. That's what he said, and yet he couldn't even come to terms with that own conclusion of his philosophy.
Regarding Kuhn as a figure, in 1969, he wrote a postscriptum for the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he tried to make clear that his view of the scientific discovery process as a human process involving consensus and subjective values and power play and so forth, and the inability for us to gather neutral data, the paradigm ladenness of data, he tried to clarify that was not an ontological view, that he was not adopting necessarily an idealist view that reality is purely a mental phenomenon. He was taking an epistemic view, a la Kant, that whatever reality is, all we can have access to is our subjective apprehension of it.
Yeah.
Do you think he really meant that from the beginning, that he was ontologically neutral from the beginning? Or do you think he was backpedaling? Because when you read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he talks about the world itself changing when the paradigm changes, that has such a power of idealism in it. Do you think he backpedaled? He got scared with the reaction?
I think he did, and the question to my mind is whether he was trying to express what he really thought, or he was trying to do damage control, because he realized that his philosophy of science was being used in ways that were discrediting science, and he was horrified by that. Kuhn insisted that all along that he was pro-science, even though if you go back and read Structure of Scientific Revolution, it's incredibly derogatory towards science in certain sections. He's got this one section I like to quote where he compares scientists who are committed to a certain paradigm to addicts, to drug addicts, and how, when the paradigm shatters, they go through a withdrawal process. In answer to your question, I'm going to cite my friend Jim McClellan again. He said that when he studied under Kuhn, so this would have been shortly after Kuhn wrote what you just mentioned. This was in the 1970s, that Kuhn was definitely a realist. He believed that, the world was out there, and the world is what it is. And this would be a kind of Kantian notion. And his philosophy was just about the sort of the limits of our ability to really see that world as it is. So,
which in itself is an abstraction, right? Because you can't access that world. It's an article of belief that you say that it is there. If you adopt Kuhn's view fully, integrally, it becomes an act of belief. It becomes paradigmatic in itself.
So this is one of the ways I try to understand this, and I guess this does come across as naive, but that I just wanted acknowledgement that science, that we shouldn't be embarrassed and use air quotes when we use the term discovery, right? So I've already talked about some things that I think count as legitimate discoveries: the shape of the Earth, the pattern of the solar system, heliocentrism, subatomic particles, and so forth. Another example that I love, and that I actually mentioned to Kuhn, and he just rejected it, and rejected my understanding of it, was the discovery of galaxies. So, it's extraordinary to me that only about 100 years ago, that there was still this debate over what those little smudges in the night sky are. And, Kant himself speculated that those little smudges might be other island universes like the Milky Way, really far away. The majority belief, even at the beginning of the 20th century, was that no, those were just gas clouds within the Milky Way, and the Milky Way basically is the universe. And then, just because we got bigger instruments, we discovered, oh my God, those are island universes. Those are galaxies way far away. That was a discovery that just suddenly expanded the whole universe and gave us this a true picture of the structure of the universe that is irrevocable. It's inconceivable, and I think it's philosophy at its most absurd to say that there will be some period in the future when we look back and we realize that we really should have had air quotes around galaxies all along, that galaxies are just going to go away, and we'll see them in some entirely different way, in the same way that we've shifted our view of what the elements of matter are.
You said that Kuhn rejected that. Can you share with us how he rejected this?
Well, let me give you another example of, so I mentioned a few different examples. When I interviewed Kuhn, there was a debate over, and here again gets into how consequential philosophy of science can be. There was a debate over whether AIDS was actually caused by this thing that was being called the AIDS virus. And I said, surely that is an empirical question that can be resolved by experiments, and we know that one idea is wrong and another idea is correct. And Kuhn rejected that. Kuhn said that no, that there are these two competing stories, and that you can never say even that the old idea that the AIDS virus is caused by something other than this particular virus, that the disease of AIDS is caused by this virus, that you can't say that is it's true or false. When he was talking about when I mentioned the example of the galaxies, he just kind of waves his hands and says that that might become a permanent part of our knowledge, but still it should always be considered tentative and revisable, given that science can evolve in the future and there still might be future paradigm shifts. All of which sort of, again, I can grant, but then would add that it's sort of trivial.
Yeah.
And it trivializes science in a way that I think is harmful to science and is harmful more generally to all human efforts to understand the world and make social progress.
If I can contribute just one little thought on something you said a moment earlier, John, on the example of AIDS being caused by HIV or some other factor. I think, even if you accept Kuhn, you know that there is such a thing as true theories and false theories within the context of a paradigm, and the difficulty is to say, when are you crossing the border of the paradigm and things become relative? I think if you accept the paradigm that certain illnesses are caused by microorganisms, even within Kuhn, you can state that AIDS is caused by the HIV virus, because that's a question framed by the paradigm that microorganisms cause disease. I wouldn't interpret Kuhn as saying, well, that is also relative.
I have posted a transcript of my entire interview with Kuhn. I posted it years ago, and I'm not sure if it's still on a website. I'm going to try to retrieve that and repost it, because I think we had a discussion about this exact same point, and I know there's a lot of interest in what Kuhn actually thought and how he would react when he was confronted with some of these problems for his philosophy. And I was astonished at how radical he was when I talked to him in rejecting the hope for resolving what I thought were very clear-cut problems, like does AIDS come from the AIDS virus or not?
Wow.
And as I said, that's to me when this becomes more than just an academic philosophical dispute. It's about really serious problems that are facing the world, where lives hang in the balance.
Yeah, serious social implications for that.
Yes.
Yeah. If I go back now to you, to your first book, The End of Science, maybe before I ask you the question, maybe if you could share with us a quick summary of your main conclusion in that book, your main drive.
Yeah, so it was inspired by this idea that was coming from physics. Stephen Hawking had said in Brief History of Time that physicists might be on the verge of coming up with a final theory of physics, a unified theory so powerful that it could basically answer all the questions that physicists were interested in once and for all. That was such a mind-blowing idea that I started wondering if it was possible for science as a whole to come to a kind of final understanding of reality. And so that led me to the conclusion that science might not explain everything, but science might go as far as it could in explaining the mystery of the universe, given that we operate under all these kinds of of economic and social and physical and cognitive constraints. And so in the book, I argued that science, in the really grand sense of providing these deep insights into nature, might already be very near its end. That the best, that the greatest discoveries, the great revolutions are behind us, as embodied by the theory of evolution, the modern theory of genetics, the Big Bang theory of the universe, quantum mechanics, relativity, and so on. So that was basically it.
That gives me a great segue to the question I wanted to ask you. I could envision two underlying contexts for this moment when we reach the end of science, the end of all the great scientific revolutions, in which very few anomalies are left, so few and far in between that we can ignore them, and that the paradigm becomes established in a way. I could imagine that on the one hand this happens because we are very close to the truth, as close as we can get given the barrier of language, because truth itself is ineffable, but given that barrier of language and our brain structures and our social constraints, as you alluded to, we got as close as we can possibly get. So any little shift will take us further away, and there will be a pull to bring the system back, like you found the global minimum of the system.
Yeah.
The other scenario is we get stuck in a local minimum, in the sense that because of confirmation bias, because the paradigm self-reinforces in the way that it makes you choose what to experiment with, it gives you a context for interpreting your experiments and your perceptions, that we refine the paradigm to a point where the self-reinforcement is so great that we cannot dislodge it from that local minimum, and it will feel exactly the same way as a paradigm that is in the global minimum. Is there a way to differentiate between these two scenarios of the end of science, John?
Probably not. Although there are such brilliant, imaginative people out there who are always going to be raging against the limits of knowledge, that I don't think we will ever become complacent and just accept whatever our current knowledge is. We might not be able to transcend it, but there will always be people who try. And there are such enormous mysteries left also, that people are always going to be, unless we all retreat into virtual reality or get brain chips that make us blissed out all the time, we're always going to be still so puzzled by the universe and by ourselves. Above all, we're the greatest mystery of all, that we're going to be trying to break out of whatever our current paradigms are. I mean, it's going back to the brain and mind. Our understanding of our brains is so pathetically bad, as manifested by our terrible therapies for mental illness, that we will, neuroscience is always going to be a very vibrant and exciting field, even if it's really not making that much progress, at least in the near term. I will say that I think that particle physics, cosmology, I really think have hit the wall, and I don't see much hope for them. The one area of science that I think has the possibility of breaking science wide open again, and in the classic Kuhnian revolutionary sense, is neuroscience. If neuroscientists can understand the neural code, the kind of software that turns physiological processes in the mind into these perceptions and thoughts that we're sharing right now, then that will have enormous philosophical, intellectual implications, and also enormous practical implications, and all bets are off.
You also wrote a book called Rational Mysticism: Spirituality Meets Science in the Search for Enlightenment. And that has to do with brain science and the interplay between the material brain and consciousness, right? What were your biggest, most significant insights in that book?
Well, that book was inspired by this period I went through in my youth when I was fascinated by mysticism. I read Aldous Huxley and I read William James, and I meditated and did yoga and took psychedelic drugs like a lot of people in my generation, and there was this idea that there are these states of mind that you could achieve where you would know reality, you would see absolute truth in a way that was impossible through rational means. And I wanted to study that and try to see whether that kind of mystical knowledge was compatible in any way with science. So I sought out all these people who had the same sorts of interest in mysticism that I did, who tried to understand mysticism from the inside subjectively and also from the outside as scientists or scholars. So here's what I came up with, that mysticism for me, and this is not a universal mystical experience, but my takeaway from the experiences that I've had is that reality is fucking weird, and it's so improbable, and that there's no possible explanation for why we should be here. The odds are infinitely against our own existence, and yet here we are. So it was kind of this eye-popping sense of wonder, but the word wonder doesn't do justice to this feeling as I experienced. Just the infinite improbability of reality is what I felt. And that is compatible with science in the following way. So the great paradox of modern science is that it's told us so much about the world. And I've already told you about some of these great discoveries that I believe should be seen as discoveries and as true facts about the world. In spite of all that, there are these profound mysteries. Where did the universe come from in the first place? We have no idea. Why does the universe have the particular structure that we've discovered, and not some totally different structure that wouldn't have allowed life like ours to come into being? Total mystery. And it does. And I am sure that mystery will not go away. Why did life emerge on Earth when it did 4 billion years ago? Why, once life emerged, did it evolve in this direction that produced us? These bizarre creatures that it can actually contemplate their own existence and their own origins and feel this sense of wonder. So if you define a miracle as something that is infinitely improbable and yet it happens,
then this is a miracle.
Then existence is a miracle, and that is something that science leads to that conclusion, and mysticism gives us a direct, visceral, emotional experience of that same realization. So that's where the two are compatible.
I'd like to thank John for having taken the time to talk to me. He has a very busy schedule. Our conversation was a little bit impromptu. He sent me an email earlier today saying, "I have time now. Are you around? Let's do it now." So I rushed to the computer and we did it. Many thanks to him for making himself available. I appreciate it very much. It is not a secret that I am myself an idealist, that I believe that the simplest metaphysical interpretation for reality is that reality is fundamentally a mental phenomenon, a subjective phenomenon, that it is not separate and outside of mind as materialism entails. I know John does not share this point of view. It has been very clear in our conversation that he is a realist. He said that explicitly. I respect his position. I disagree with it. But I think realism, on the face of it, is an eminently reasonable metaphysics, because it seems to explain this disconnect that we experience firsthand between our own thoughts and volition and the way reality unfolds according to very stable patterns and regularities. I have an alternative explanation for that, which I'm not going to get into in here. But to me, a key takeaway from this dialogue, this rich dialogue, is what I personally perceive as the tremendous inherent power of this archetype of an external absolute truth, a truth external to subjective apprehension, a truth outside of mind and preceding mind. Irrespective of whether this is just a psychological archetype, as I hold, because I am an idealist, or whether it corresponds to empirical fact, whether it's the correct metaphysical interpretation for reality, irrespective of that, it is clearly a strong psychological archetype. And I think that has come through in my dialogue with John, that difference between our ways of interpreting reality and interpreting the data. But it is precisely this difference in perspective, this difference in ideas and interpretations of empirical fact that I think you have seen between me and John. When it's debated with respect and candidness, it is precisely that difference that makes for an interesting dialogue, I think. I'm very happy with this episode. I'm very happy and grateful for the opportunity to talk to John, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. So see you next time in the next episode of Inception Dialogues. Till then.